definitely kind of how I came to be doing this work that I'm doing. And it really was during those early elementary school years. And when I first was kind of realizing that my son was moving through the world in a way that was unexpected and that was going to kind of steer us off the path that we thought we were on. And kind of, the lowest point, I think, for us was at the end, or it was halfway through first grade. And we had been in a school for a year and a half. It was a private school for gifted kids. And I'd been told many times in that first year, like, we get these kids, we've got this. And, I was presenting them with, here are strategies that are working at home, or here are the guidelines our OT is giving us. And I was really trying to be forthcoming with how to best support what I knew could be dysregulating behavior. And they're like, we've got this. And we went, I don't know what happened. It was like one week, everything changed, and suddenly we were in emergency mode, and I was getting called in for meetings. And I kind of, I wrote about this in my book, but I kind of I felt like I was just brought in for this like inquisition. I had this meeting in a little classroom after school with all of the teachers sitting around, and they just went through one by one and telling me, this is happening, and this has been disruptive, and this is a problem. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, I thought we were here to support my child and figure out how to make this work. And I realized in that moment, no, they're kind of saying that this is not working and you guys need to look for another school. And that really kind of started, I think, planted the seed for what I eventually created through Tilt Parenting, in that I just started realizing that first of all, that we weren't alone, and that there were so many parents who were experiencing similar things in schools all over the country, all over the world, and getting information that their children aren't thriving in school, and it's not being done in a way that feels good. It's being in a way that can be shaming for the parent, that can traumatize the child. And that really did kind of kick off my own process, which took many years, but of trying to really discover how can we change, what we're doing for our child? How can we create something that would best support who he is? But that was when I think about kind of where this all came from, that's the moment that really resonates with me.
Hello, this is Don.
And this is Gina with Focused Healthy Family.
And this is podcast number 74. And we're talking about differently wired kids with Debbie Reber.
So the story you listen to is from a podcast Don recorded when he was doing the Invisible Wheelchair podcast before we started our Focused Healthy Family podcast. And there's just some great information in this podcast, as it's the end of August and kids are starting to go back to school. Some places where we live, they've already gone back to school, and thinking about our kids and their education and how they function. And I really enjoyed listening to Debbie and talking about Tilt Parenting that she created, and about differently wired children. And it's kind of a new way of looking at kids who have what used to be called neuroatypical. So you've got neurotypical, how the average person functions, how their brain works, if they fit into the school system. And they started using the term neuroatypical, meaning different. And I love, she talks about just the difference, that it's not a negative per se, that we all have differently wired brains, and so there's all positives and negatives into what our skills and strengths are, and kind of recognizing those things and knowing what works.
Well, and I like the fact she talks about diagnosis versus different, and how not to ignore diagnosis, that can be helpful, but to really not let it define the child.
Right. It's information about what it is. And she created this term of differently wired to kind of put all of those diagnoses into one bucket, because she said when you look at it that way, it's like 20% of the population. So it's really not that uncommon. It's just they manifest differently. But all these kids often have difficulty with school and fitting into the way that school is structured and set up, because it's set up to teach in a way that works for some kids, but not all kids. We all have different learning styles. And so as the school year is beginning, we'd love to talk more education and thought this was a great place to start.
And of course, today, since this was an interview that was an audio interview, we don't have a video. But I hope you enjoy listening to Debbie and talking about differently wired children. When what's amazing about it is that those moments, how they change and direct your whole different path, and you've went down a really neat path. You've developed the tilt parenting, which as I looked over it is just wonderful. So what I was going to ask you, Debbie, is if you could define what you mean by differently wired.
Yes. So differently wired is a term I started using when I created Tilt about 4 years ago because, for two reasons. One is I recognize that there are all these diagnoses that many of our kids have, often more than one, whether it's ADHD or anxiety or autism spectrum or being gifted or having a learning disability, dyslexia, dysgraphia, OCD, so many different things. And I recognized, that a lot of the language used feels either medicalized or negative, right? We talk about deficits and disorders and epidemics of autism. And, it creates a sense of fear. It creates a sense of negativity and of that this is a bad thing, right? That's the underlying message. And I wasn't okay with that, number one. And number two, this idea of us all having these separate diagnoses for our kids, but it really kept us divided and didn't really demonstrate the fact that there are so many people moving through the world differently. And it's not okay for the at least 20% of kids who have some sort of neuro difference to be seen as outliers, because they're not. They're a huge portion of the population. And so when I started using the term differently wired, I really wanted it to be a bucket to capture all of those different ways of moving through the world. And so, we were talking before we hit record, it is about a different wiring. Like everyone's brain is wired differently, really, right? We're all unique in how we move through the world. So it worked on that level, but also it's a positive way of saying, my child or I'm someone who sees things or experiences things differently than what might be considered typical. But it's not a deficit, it's a difference. I'm just differently wired. And so I started using that and it just took off. It just resonated with so many people.
Well, and that kind of leads, you've kind of answered the next one in a way, but I was curious, as you mentioned here, keeping the negativity out, and I would guess that's why this happened, but why you decided on using differently wired versus using the diagnosis, calling my child autistic or calling my child having OCD. Like we went through this in our own, just trying to decide whether we were going to use those terms and define it that way. And we found that it helped to help her to know that she had OCD. It helped to kind of put a definition and make her feel better that she wasn't going crazy. But why did you feel to use differently wired versus a diagnosis?
Well, I'll just clarify to say that we do use the diagnosis, and I am for that, right? So Asher, my son, 15-year-old son, he has ADHD. It's something we talk very openly about. Like, this is the part of the ADHD that can be so cool. Like the energy that you're putting into this project, that's incredible. And we also recognize that sometimes distraction can interrupt things, or just having a hard time managing time, or some of the executive functioning things. So we actually talk openly about it. And I encourage parents to use the labels, because I think that we can own them. I think the problem is that a lot of the labels carry stigma. And so, it's complicated, right? So here's what I'll say. believe in the diagnostic process. I believe it can be really helpful to find out if there are, diagnoses that apply to our kids, because that can put things in context. It could give us some tools we might not otherwise know about. It can help get accommodations and support in school. And it doesn't define who our kid is. It's just information about them. It can be empowering information for them to understand who they are and to know they're not alone. So I encourage parents to go down that path and get the information, but also know that it doesn't fix anything. It's not about fixing the child. It's about better understanding who they are. And Differently Wired, more than anything, is a way to kind of capture all of us together and have more of a positive spin when we're talking in general about these kids, and not keeping us separated right into our little diagnostic buckets. Does that make sense?
No, it makes a lot of sense. And I think in a way, having a positive definition of it is actually more healthy than, not that knowing that it's OCD can be healthy, but it also can have a detrimental side of, oh my gosh, all the negative and, like you say, the stigma around it. So I think you're right in that it could be a negative effect, whereas having a positive term like that can be more healthy for the child. So maybe if you could give us an idea, maybe back then or when during the tougher part of this, what was a typical day for your family,
Yeah. There have been a couple phases. So I would say, there were 3 years there. Well, actually more if you count preschool, but there were years there up through second grade where I was really trying to get things back on track in my mind, what I thought this was supposed to look like, and finding the right school fit and really helping, our family look the way I wanted it to look, right? I wanted to be able to put my son in a summer camp and just be like, cool, good to go. Call me when it's time to pick him up, and not get those phone calls, an hour later, like, can you come get your kid? So during those years, a typical day would be struggling to get out the door, kind of me trying to keep my calm and us typically running late or just having a lot of emotions to deal with, even getting to school. It would be me getting home from dropping him off and dreading when the phone rang, because if I saw the number that it was calling and I was like, oh no, it's school. And I was like, but I had so much work to do today. And then getting a call that something had gone wrong. Sometimes I didn't have to pick up, but I just needed to touch base with the teacher afterwards. So my days were very unpredictable while he was at school, because I just never knew what was going to happen. So there was kind of a perpetual anxiety and dread. Then after school, I just never knew what I was going to get, right? I remember, especially in second grade, I would pick him up and my son's teacher would walk all the kids out, and we would always make eye contact. And I could just tell by the look in his eye if it had been like a good day or things went off the rails. So that helped me prepare a little bit. But then 3-4 days a week, I was then taking, my son to OT or to a social skills group or, something else like that. And then getting home and just kind of trying to get through the rest of the day without losing it, because there was oftentimes the big release came after school, right? The emotional release from holding it in together during the day. And then just going to bed, getting him to sleep and being like, thank goodness. And then, having an hour to watch, I guess Netflix wasn't around back then, but I don't know. We just watched TiVoed programming, and then be like, oh gosh, we have to do this all over again tomorrow. Mm. So that's a typical day back in the kind of the really rough years.
And I take it that's changed now.
Yes. Yeah, it's so different now. I mean, after second grade, we moved abroad and I homeschooled Asher for 6 years, and that was its own journey. And the first year was pretty rough, and it just got better and better. And to the point where last year, towards the end of his 8th grade year, we were just like, I think we're done with this. We looked at each other. We're like, is this working anymore? Are you ready to go back to school? Do you want to go to school? I think you're ready to go back to school. And he's like, yeah, I think we need to do something different. And so he is now in a school. He's in a private school here in New York, and he loves school. He's a teenager. You know, it's hard to get him up in the morning sometimes, but he's just I can't even believe the amazing human that he is, because it's, you know, during those really hard years, I just couldn't imagine it wasn't always going to be hard, you know?
Well, I would imagine, like ourselves back then, you wonder if it's going to go on forever. You know, am I going to be taking care of this child till whenever? You know,
Absolutely.
It sounds very familiar. All of that sounds very familiar. We used to call it walking on eggshells. You know, wondering when the next thing is going to drop. You know,
Yep.
there were times at 9 o'clock at night, I'd be looking at my watch going, we're doing it. We're going to get to bed without any kind, you know, and then something would break loose, you know. So
Yeah.
I fully understand that. So in your business now, your organization, the Tilt Parenting, how do you help people? What do you do in that organization, and how do you feel like you help people?
Well, I started it initially because I didn't think it was okay that parents like me were feeling alone and that we didn't know how to even access the information we needed. And we felt like we were just going through this and no one got it. And so I initially created it as kind of a rally cry. So when I launched Tilt Parenting, I launched it with a huge manifesto. I spent like 6 months writing this manifesto to kind of rally everybody and say, listen, you're not alone. Our kids are amazing and they deserve to be seen and respected for who they are. And we deserve to love parenting these kids. Like, we deserve to be seen and respected for our experience. So I wanted parents to connect with that so they could instantly feel a sense of community that they may have been lacking and feel like they found a place to belong. I call it the other club. Like, it's not the club we thought we'd be in, but it's actually a really awesome club. And I also launched it with a podcast. So I just released episode 201 yesterday. So that's been amazing. And I've talked with everyone, like all the people on my dream list when I first launched, of authors and thought leaders that I wanted to talk to. I've had pretty much all of them on my show at this point. So that has been a tremendous resource for parents. So that's how it started. And since then, I just kind of, as the community grows and lets me know what they need, I offer more things. So right now they're called Tilt Together groups. So a lot of people wanted to connect in real life. And so these are parent-led groups that have started all over the world, mostly in the US, but there are some in the UK and in Australia and New Zealand. And these are people who just want to get together in real life. There's also an online community on Facebook called Tilt Together, where parents just share resources or get a recommendation for a therapist in South Bend, Indiana, or whatever they're looking for. And then most recently, I created something called Tilt Education, because I really want to figure out how can we, education's a huge piece of this, right? Like, because that's where so many of our kids are struggling. And so I want to figure out how we can better communicate and align with our kids' teachers. So there are some resources for teachers. But then I've also just created this huge database of schools that has been crowdsourced and from my community. There's over 200 schools now that are friendly to differently wired kids. And most of those listings, they're organized by state and country, they include testimonials from parents who have experience there. So that took me about a year to pull together, and it's continuing to grow. But I'm really excited about that, because I think it is trying to find the right educational fit that creates the most stress for so many parents.
Well, I think you even mentioned it. I'm trying to think where I read it. You get into this when you realize that you have a child that's like finding a resource and finding we didn't know where to go, where to turn, who to go to, what, and like with OCD, there's not a lot of therapists that know how to deal with it, and doctors
Mhm.
that even know how to deal with it. So, yeah, that is a resource. Your resource is beautiful for that, because that's exactly what we look for when we get to that place in our life. So that's great. Well, Debbie, it has been a joy to talk with you here. What I'd like to do now is just to let you tell my audience. Well, first of all, let me ask you this. Is there any other message that you would like to get out to this audience?
Well, I think the thing I always try to remind parents, especially if they're newer in the diagnostic process and they're just kind of realizing what's going on and feeling overwhelmed, is to just remember that your child isn't broken, that they may need support in certain areas, and they may have either lagging skills or areas where they're going to need some extra support, but they also are incredibly creative, resourceful, whole beings in their own right. And just to really kind of check ourselves and make sure that we're seeing our jobs as really seeing who they are and becoming kind of fluent in the language that is our kids, the way they express their feelings and thoughts and emotions through behavior often. But our job is to figure that out and then meet them there and say, okay, how can I support this child? As opposed to, getting into panic mode, like, oh my God, this is a huge problem and I have to fix, because our kids can internalize that message that there's something really wrong with them. And we don't want that for them. We want them to know that, yeah, you're experiencing this. It can be really hard and we'll get through it together. And here's how we can support each other.
Well, the last thing I'll ask is letting my audience know how they can best find out more about you. And I'll remind my audience that I will put this up on the Invisible Wheelchair site, invisiblewheelchair.com. But if you want to let them know some of the best ways to find out about you, I'll open that up for you right now.
Sure, thank you. So the website is tiltparenting.com, and that is kind of the hub for most everything that I talked about. And there are many other resources. That lengthy manifesto I mentioned is on there, which you can read or listen to. And you can poke around and actually search by theme at the podcast if you kind of want to flip through and find what might resonate. And then on social media, I love Instagram. I'm there at Tilt Parenting. On Facebook, there's the Tilt Parenting page, but that group I mentioned, that's the real community where you might be able to find therapists, and you can just pop on and say, oh my gosh, I'm desperate for this help. You'll get a bunch of answers. That's Tilt Together. So it's facebook.com/groups/Tilt Together, or just search Tilt Together in the search bar.
Well, Debbie, like I said, I have truly enjoyed talking with you, and I love what you're doing. I think the way you have made a positive aspect out of this is just beautiful. And I will put you up there and put the information out there so more people can find out about you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
We hope you've enjoyed the podcast today and the re-airing of the interview with Debbie Reber. We would love to hear from you, especially as we're talking about education and children. Please leave us a comment, reach out to us, send us a message at Focused Healthy Family. You can learn more on our website, look at the workshops we have, look at our blog, find out more about our Tuesday tips that you can get via email, or join us on Tuesdays when we air a short podcast that's 15 minutes or less and kind of covering a tip for parents. All of this is found at Focused Healthy Family. You can see me, Gina, at focusedhealthyfamily.com on Instagram.
You can find us on Facebook at Focused Healthy Family. And remember, how you speak to your children today shapes their future and yours.